Hi, and welcome to Spooky Hours. My name's David Saunderson. Today we're going up north. We're going to Edinburgh. Now, anyone who's got any kind of interest in ghosts of the British Isles knows that there's a number of cities in the Spooky Isles that get people very excited. One would be London, one would be York in Yorkshire, and the other one is Edinburgh. A wonderful town, lots of great ghost stories, and we've got a good friend up there, John Tantalon, who runs North Edinburgh Nightmares, which, as it sounds, is all about spooky stuff in North Edinburgh. So we're going to be talking to him today about some of the hauntings in that area, some of the books he's doing, and just generally having a chat about ghosts in Edinburgh. So, John Tantalon, North Edinburgh Nightmares. Hello, John. How are you today?
Not bad. Good to meet you.
It's very, very good to be seeing you in person for the first time. It's great to hear from you. Over the years, I've seen lots of your stuff on the Twitter and read your stuff. And you've also written for us. You've written a recent spooky story about the prison up there in Edinburgh. But it always surprises me how much ghosts there are in Edinburgh. What's that all about?
It's a famously haunted place because of its history. I mean, it's a very old part of Scotland. It's seen incredible misery. It's seen incredible progress, all of which seems to have progressed its own ghosts along the way. Um, and for such a famous place, Edinburgh's not big. I mean, it's not as big as many its counterparts. So many of these stories, they're all kind of combined. I mean, you can kind of walk them, if you will. You don't have to travel far to encounter some of these famous locations.
I think that's right. I mean, I remember when I first encountered you a number of years ago, and you had I saw that was in North Edinburgh. I thought that's very specific. That's very specific for a town that's not very big.
Yeah.
But then I suppose when we think of ghosts, we think of the old city, which is
Mm.
just magnificent, and anyone should go there if they're interested in just history. Never mind ghosts; it's just beautiful looking.
Mm.
What do you consider North? What is North Edinburgh? What does that mean?
Well, I mean, basically, you've got with Edinburgh, you've got the old town, famous. Everyone knows the old town, where the castle is, etc. Then you've got the new town, which has its fair share of stories as well, and that's kind of on the way to where I grew up. Where I grew up was in an area called Trinity, which is close to the harbour and the kind of coast of Edinburgh. If you go along from here, you have a very ancient place called New Haven, which has some stories. You have a very famous place that was separate from Edinburgh until 1920 called Leith. And then you have Edinburgh's seaside, which is called Portobello. And all these places were, independent until 1920 when Edinburgh amalgamated the whole place. So on that sort of scale of things, it's a lot bigger.
Yeah, so
But as I said, growing up in this area was where I encountered the stories as a youngster. And my granddad, was a great storyteller. He was also a man who'd spent a lot of time on the Edinburgh trawler boats sailing out from where I live at Trinity Granton Harbour. So that is, kind of where the stories came from. And over the years, I, culminated many. And a lot of them were lesser known. So that's one of the reasons I thought I'm going to try and put the stories of the north of Edinburgh on the map.
So, how did your granddad told you these stories? Were they particularly spooky stories? Were they folklore? What kind of stories were they?
Well, the stories, a lot of them were from his time in the navy when he sailed out, from this area, and he had many sort of stories of battles during the wartime and about how Edinburgh had changed and how the trawler boats were commissioned as minesweepers. All these were interesting tales, but there was one spooky one that stood out from the rest, and he always told me and my brother this one, and it was the story of a mysterious 13th trawlerman. Would you like to hear it?
Oh, absolutely. I'm waiting you to tell me.
Okay, here we go. So the story, it's appeared in my first book, and it's called Slangivar, and it goes like this. So my granddad would sail, for his years he was in the merchant navy, and then working on Her Majesty's trawlers. He'd sail out of this harbour across the road from where I am today, which is now called Wardy Bay, but used to be better known as Granton Harbour. And their trips would usually see them going out to the Faroe Islands, out to, to Norway, out to the Shetlands, Orkney, parts like this. They were big trips for a wee boat with 13 sort of members, It took them a while to accomplish. And there was this one time they went out for maybe a week and a half out to the Faroe Islands. And there was one of the crew, a local man called Geordie Walker, at the back of the boat. The boat was called the Alma. And from out in nowhere, pretty calm weather, there was this thunderous wave, got a hold of Geordie Walker and put him off the side of the boat. So the rest of the crew rushed over, like man in the water. And before they could really get a gist of what happened, he came back from the other side of the boat and onto the deck hard. He was the luckiest guy in the world that day. So they got him and they says, what on earth happened? How did you go overboard? I mean, they were all seasoned sailors. And he says, it was that guy, the new guy, clear as day, came to me. He says he either tried to push me off the boat or stop me from going off the boat. It was one or the other. He says, where is he? He says, he's there. Where is he? The guy. And he says, what guy? You're havering. There's no new guy. And he says, I remember him down to the hand when it grabbed me. He says his hand, he had a tattoo in his hand. It was a thistle and it had the word Slangy, which means good luck. So the rest of the crew, put it down to just shock for being in the took Geordie below. My granddad knew better. So when they docked at the middle pier, which is, across from where we are just now, they got everything off the boat, the big catch and stuff, and they proceeded to their local watering hole. Their local pub was called the Granton Tap. And that's where my granddad took Geordie Walker aside and told him a story. And that's the one I'm going to tell you now. So the previous year, the crew of the Alma were sailing on a very similar voyage to the Faroe Isles. And it was very similar scenarios. A very good catch. The boat was full of fish. They docked at the middle pier of Granton Harbour, and they unloaded the catch into the pier. But there was a man on board called Mr. Ross, a local man. He was climbing the steps from the Alma when he lost his balance. So Mr. Ross went flying from the metal railings head first onto the deck of the boat. The only man that was there was my granddad. He rushed over. He tried to hold this poor man's head together. The blow was so severe. And he shouted, medic, medic, man down, come and help him. But sadly, before they could arrive, poor Mr. Ross passed out of consciousness, and his life passed from him. And all my granddad could do was hold his hand for the pulse as he died. And it was the same hand with a thistle and the word Slangivar upon it. So the story goes, was it the spirit of Mr. Ross trying to stop Geordie Walker from falling off the boat or trying to push him? We'll never know. But that was the story that always stuck with me as a child.
That's very close to you too. I mean, it's one. It's a person you knew, and one that's just out. You say it's just out your door here.
It's there.
Not
It's
far.
right across the road. Yeah.
So that was, What did he think of that? What did your granddad think?
He had many. I mean, he was a great storyteller.
No. But what did he think of that particular tale? What was his? I mean,
Well, that was his culmination. He thought it was the spirit of Mr. Ross coming back to prevent a tragedy happening again, because the tragedy had happened to him. But it was Geordie Walker's sort of recollection against everyone else. Nobody saw it. But there was a strange twist of fate some years later. So that story appeared in a local Edinburgh newspaper I published, when I was doing my first book. And somebody got in touch with the newspaper and asked to get my email address. And it was the grandson of Geordie Walker. And the reason that, I spoke to him and stuff, and he said, I've not thought of that story in so many years. And there was one key bit to it that I missed out, and he knew it. And that's what I said. He knows the story. He's the real Geordie Walker's son. I thought it was an incredible coincidence for him to get in touch like that. It was brilliant.
Are you a particularly superstitious man? Do you believe in ghosts?
To an extent. I mean, I've spent my whole life kind of not necessarily looking for things. I've been in plenty of predicaments where I could with my work and stuff. I work in a very old building. But in 2014, it all changed when I actually, encountered something I couldn't explain. There's been a couple of small instances along the way, but that's the only time I could really say it was something that.
What was that one? What was that? What happened in 2014? That
to cut it short, there was a friend of mine he was a security guard, and he's had, kind of working for this company where they go around in a car around Edinburgh. If alarms go off, he's the guy to check there's no burglars. And he got a bit of overtime in a very old building called Craigcrook Castle in the Blackhall area of the city. It's still for sale now, I believe. They can't sell it. £6 million price tag. And it was overtime from what all he had to do was go around this castle with his torch every hour, make sure it was secure. Now, every time he came back, he sat down. It was like a little bothy. He had his flask of tea. So he'll sit down, shut that drawer, and sit and just chill out for a bit. And he went round, second time, came back, sat down, shut the drawer. 6 times before he thought, who's opening this blooming drawer? He says, I'm the only one here. And every time he went, the drawer was open. So he told me about this. He says, yeah, it was something quite spooky about this place. He's a sort of no-nonsense guy, this bloke. He does the doors, the cowgate and stuff. He's like a doorman and things. And he says, do you want to look at it if I get the keys? And I says, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to see this place. We went that first time about 11 o'clock at night after my shift, and it was marvellous seeing this part of Edinburgh history. And some months passed, and he said, I've got the keys one more time for this Craigcrook. Do you want to see it for a last time? And I was on night shift. So in my break, I headed over about 2 a.m. And he said, do you want to do the walk round first? Cup of tea, or what would you rather do? I said, we'll go and do the walk round and we'll settle down. And we went to the second floor. First floor, nothing. Second floor, we went in and the door opened by itself. Now, I thought that could just be stepping on a floorboard or whatever. The second thing that happened was there was a big brass doorknob to a door that went up a flight of stairs, just fell off in front of us. Big noise. And at that point, directly behind my friend Peter, the door blew open at full force and slammed. And there was an enormous rush of scent, just flooded the hall. And at that point, we ran for our life. And we didn't go back. I think he did the rest of the shift in his car. That's the only real thing I've encountered that I can't put my finger on. Afterwards, I did some research into the building, and there has been stories about it in the past from a Lord Geoffrey, I think his name was. But it was one of those things, the brass handle, the door, I couldn't explain it. And that was the only time anything of that extent I've witnessed. And I was a changed man that night. I really was.
But you've obviously spoken to lots of people over the time. You've researched. You've written a number of books. You've got a new book coming out, which is we'll talk about a little bit later, which is from the south of England, which is about as far away as you can get. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what are some of the other stories that you've heard around the places? I believe there might be a famous resident that's still floating around your area that you've spoken about before.
It's an interesting one. So we do a few ghost walks around Edinburgh. I do one in the new town, which has proved hugely popular, and I do one sort of down by the harbour down here. And we take in maybe 13 local stories because there's some pretty good ones. And there is a lady that came on the ghost walk called Judith, and she relayed it to us. Now, Judith used to work as a nurse in a nearby hospital, a hospice. Now, the hospice, it used to be a very famous building called Challenger Lodge with an explorer called John Murray, named it after his boat, the Challenger. And Judith, in her time working there, she says many people would come to her and say, excuse me, nurse, my mum, she'd like to go to sleep now. Would you get the bed, the dog to leave the room, the wee dog that's on her bed? And she'd say, yeah, of course. Yes, certainly. Said, go in. Oh, the dog's away. I missed it. She said, there's never been a dog in the room. Countless people have came to her saying, can this dog leave the room? So she said, I've never seen this thing, So sometime later, when Jude retired, that section of the hospice was demolished. And they were rebuilding it. And when they did this, they found beneath that ward where everyone saw the dog, they found a box with bones, dog bones inside it, buried. Now, I believe that they put it back and they rebuilt on top of it. So Judith, now retired, she did some digging into the story. It was fascinating. She says, what's this story with the dog, with the bones? She found out that when it was Challenger Lodge, before it was the hospice, it was a children's home. For children with disabilities. And there was a very famous Edinburgh policeman called Willie Merrilees. He was quite a character. Did a lot of really good charity work, this guy. He was a good guy. And he would get things like celebrities to visit homes. He got famously Roy Rogers and his wife to visit Dunforth House and meet the children. In a famous story, they adopted one of the children and she lived a wonderful life in America with them as their daughter. On this occasion, he brought this famous face from a movie of that year, 1962. It was a big hit called Greyfriars Bobby. And this was the dog, the actor dog, that came along to meet the children. There's a piece of footage in the National Archive of Scotland called The Chief's Half Day, and it's a silent piece of film, but in it, it is the footage of Willie Merrilees bringing this actor dog to Challenger Lodge to meet the children. It's there, and it's fascinating. So what they reckon, what Judith reckons, is this may be the ghost of the actor that played Greyfriars Bobby in the 1962 film that is still seen today.
It's a bit creepy, isn't it? I think some of those you get a lot of stories over the years, and you think, oh yeah, whatever. I think
It's a lovely story. It
it
really
is.
is. I think it's a nice tale, you know.
It is. It's a lovely story. So I mean, we're talking about these places, and it appears from what I'm learning today is that Edinburgh was a certain size, and then it merged with a number of other areas, and now it's a lot bigger. So
Yes,
when we say North Edinburgh, as far as you're concerned, it's basically the bit around the coast and the new that. Am I right in thinking that?
yes,
That's
that's
why you. That's
exactly.
and so that's why a lot of the stories that you might be telling us are all sort of around the harbours and things like that, because that's what we're essentially looking at. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's even Leith. I mean, Leith's a very important part of Edinburgh. And there's a lot of people that consider themselves Leithers that still don't consider it part of Edinburgh
Mm.
after 1920. They said we were independent, we had our own currency, we had our own government, and that was taken when
And
Edinburgh.
currency? Their
Yeah,
currency?
yeah, they had their own currency and everything. Their own, it's an incredible story what happened in 1920. I write for a magazine called the Leither magazine, and they still have that kind of passion that they are Leithers. They're not from Edinburgh. A lot of people do. So I thought a lot of stories that I knew from Leith that hadn't ever really been written about. I thought this is time for people to hear them, and there were some
Is
really good ones
is there a particular one you'd like to tell us from Leith?
from Leith. There's a few good ones. There was a chap that I spoke to, and he lived in a place called Pitt Street, which is, I mean, it's quite a big place, Leith, but he stayed in this house in the very early 80s, the late 70s, and he's a straight up guy. His name's Callum. And he said that they realised soon after that the street that the house was built in, it was an old farmhouse. There was nothing there. So everything that was surrounding him in 1980 was all new. There was a toy factory, there was a baker's, there was things like that. And there was these two really old houses where he was living in. And they said it didn't take long for them to realise that they weren't alone. There was someone else in the building with them. And they could hear them upstairs moving around. And it got to such a normality that they'd just say, whenever they heard whatever it was upstairs, they'd say, we're putting the kettle on. Do you want a cup of tea as well? And, listen for them. They weren't scared. But there was a couple of instances that really scared the family. And there was one when his sister was upstairs with her mum and she was arguing about something. I think it was about going out uptown or something. And it was getting heated and more heated and shouting back at her mum. From out of nowhere, something just belted her across the head. And she looked at her mum and says, "What was that?" And her mum replied, "Whatever it was, you bloody deserved it." And she never answered back to her mum ever again. There was another instance where there was a relative staying in the house. It was always upstairs where things happened. And he claimed to see something at the bottom of his bed. And it was such an extent that he ran out the house. He was terrified. And this was, I don't know how old he would have been, but he was completely terrified. But speaking to the guy from the bakery, he was doing a night shift. And the rest of the family were like, "Well, you're not the first person to see anything in this house. You won't be the last. Do you want to come back in?" So they were so calm about it. But all the people encountered this property were terrified, whatever was in it. That is just one of the many stories from Leith. There are many others in my second book.
I find it interesting that none of these are kind of I'm going to say show pony type ghosts. They're not the tales of grey ladies or posh people, and this is just normal households where people are seeing strange things.
There are others. I mean, there is ones with sort of grandeur. There is the story of Mary Ann Robertson. It's a famous local one. She was known when I was growing up as the Red Lady. And there is a cemetery called Warriston Cemetery. And she had a very grand sort of grave. And so much so that when it was a sunny day, it was all red glass and the light would shine across the sarcophagus. And hence the name, the Red Lady, they called her. She was from sort of good stock, the daughter of Brigadier Robertson. And when she died unexpectedly, they wanted this memorial to her. And in the late 70s, it was tragically defaced and vandalised. And there was grave robbing involved. They stole the skull of the woman. And after that, there was instances, I don't know how true they are, of people saying they had sightings of this person, the Red Lady. That was sort of one that I grew up with. I never saw her, but I certainly saw the tomb before it was tragically demolished. But that was a classic. A lot of people have heard the story of the Red Lady.
Well, that's a bit more posh then, isn't it, about someone? You were saying before we came on, you were talking about a haunted bed. I want to know about a haunted bed. I've heard of lots of different haunted furniture before. Like, you've given us a dog. You've given, I want to find out about this haunted bed.
Okay. So what happened? Along the roads, again, north of Edinburgh, this was in the sort of Royston part of the city, a very kind of working class part of Edinburgh. And there's an old man in the 40s called Jock that lived in the street. And when Jock passed, the neighbours got the offer of buying his personal effects. They said, just give us whatever you can and you can come and get his stuff. He's not got any family and it'll go towards his funeral. So there was a neighbour called Mrs. Parson that went in and she saw this great big brass bed in the room and says, I'm having that. What does it cost? And I can't remember how much it would have been in the 40s, but it was substantial. But she said, that's a good bit of kit. I'm buying that. So with the help of some neighbours, they dismantled this big bed, took it downstairs and up to her house, which was a couple of doors down. She was delighted with this. Now, there was 7 kids lived in the house, and it was a 2-bedroom house. And the first one was the youngest, called Chris, and he was getting put in his brand new bed that night. The others were out playing. It was the school holidays. So it didn't take long for Chris to be in the bed for him to scream and alert his mum to come through. Agnes, her name was, and she went through and said, what's the matter with you? And he says, there's somebody in the room. There's somebody at the bottom of the bed. She's going, there's nobody in the room. Get back to sleep. I won't tell you again. So he did. He went back. So Agnes is carrying on with her night, doing her knitting or what have you, waiting to get the other kids in. And another scream for the room. She goes through. Here's Chris Parson, terrified, huddled beneath the covers, looking at the bottom of the bed, going, there's somebody in the room, Ma. There's a man in the room. And she's put the light and she's going, look, there's nobody here. I'm telling you, get back to sleep. So she managed to get the rest of the kids in from their sort of playing, that night. And they all came in. She was getting some of them ready to put in the new bed, some of them in the other room. She went through, with the kids. And there's Chris, sat calm as anything, in the bed, not bothered. She went, why are you not asleep? Why are you awake? He says, it's all right, Mum. He says, I'm all right. I'm just speaking to the old man. He's tired and he needs his bed back. Now, Chris Parson described old Jock exactly how he looked, and he'd never seen him before. So because of this, Agnes calmly put the rest of the kids to bed. Stuff said, right, fair enough. But tomorrow morning, this bed is going. She says he described him to a T. So she wasn't actually that shocked, because sometime before, there was a spae wife, a fortune teller, came to see her, and she says, one night in this house you will encounter a spirit, but it's not an evil spirit, it's a restless spirit, and when it comes in, all you have to say is these words and it'll go away and leave you. And she did that, and the words were, God bless you, who are you? She said these words, went to her bed. And the next day, with the help of some local lads, they took the bed apart and removed it. So she says she dumped it down an alleyway, and the ghost of Jock was never seen again in the house. So some years after, like when my first book came out, I was speaking to a relative of Agnes Parson, And she said to me, "Oh, I love that story." She says, "You know, in your book, the one about the guy on the boat and stuff." She said, "I've got a weird one." She says, "See, when I moved out the house, my mum gave me this old brass bed, and I had the weirdest dreams in it, I'll tell you." So maybe she didn't dump it after all,
It's
and she
probably
just
not.
passed it on. But I love that story as well about old Jock with the bed, and all the people are real. You know, the family.
Yeah, and that's what's I think what's good about it. It's not you've heard from a friend from a friend. I mean, you have
Yeah.
heard from a friend, but they're people saying. So isn't listen. Do you obviously do a lot of research? You're talking to people. A lot of this is your own memories and what people have told you. Do you do any investigations? Do you go out do any ghost hunting at times or anything like that?
I have been involved with some. It's never been something that I know too much about to do. I've been invited along to a few things, and they were good. There was a group called Spirit Vision Paranormal Research from Cheshire, and they came up a few years back and wanted to try and get into the Nidri Street vaults, the famous vaults. And we managed to, it was during lockdown, we managed to get access to a wonderful Edinburgh pub called Whistle Binkies,
Mm.
which is at the top of the vaults, top of Nidri Street. And the staff were so kind, they let us in there all night. And the folk for Spirit Vision got all their equipment set up throughout the pub. That was the first time I've ever done anything like that. And there was a number of sort of spooky goings on. Again, I'm quite ignorant to a lot of it. I don't know about REM pods. I don't know about all the sensors. But I think they were quite impressed with our findings. We went on to do a few others. We went on to do one in the vaults. We went to a famous place in Edinburgh called the Biscuit Factory. It was the site of Crawford's Biscuits, which was, you know, a big brand, one of the biggest of the day. And my mum, back in the 50s, worked there. So we spent the night in there with an investigation. That's been about the three I've done. You know,
Mm.
there's been a few other things when they've been up, you know, visiting that they've done, but that was the ones I've done overnight with them. And they were certainly a lot of fun.
Mm. So you're more of, I would say more the historian than the active researcher for the paranormal. Is that
Yes, I mean
fair?
it's that's what takes up all my time is
And
the
that's
research
fine,
for the
and that's
stories, you know.
and that's great, and and it sounds like you've got some really good stories there, and I think they're all crackers. Now, as alluded to before, your next book, "The Haunted Realms of Surrey and Hampshire," is not from Edinburgh; it's from the south
No.
of England. How did that happen?
I've got family down there and in Aldershot, which is in Hampshire. So I've had years and years of researching these stories, and there are many from the Isle of Wight to you know, parts of Farnham, you know, all the little villages in Hampshire and Surrey. There are some absolute crackers. So I thought when I did book number 2 for North Edinburgh Nightmares, I'm going to do a compilation of some of the stories I've learned from down there. So hopefully that'll be out for Christmas.
Well, that'll be very.
And it's got lots of good ones. It really has, you know.
Well, we'll talk to you about that because we don't want to mix our things too much. Edinburgh, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
we'll get you on again and we'll talk about Surrey and Hampshire
yeah,
once that comes out because I think that'll be quite a lot of fun and interesting. Your thoughts on some of these hauntings in England. Have you
yeah.
got what have you got coming up for Christmas? You do tours?
Yes,
So how can
we.
people go on a tour with you?
You can basically do a search for North Edinburgh Nightmares. It will bring up our website where we advertise the ghost walks. They're generally they're done when people want to go on one. You know, we don't have specific dates. There's Halloween, of course. We do over the month of October. We do lots of the ghost walks. We do, you know, other parts, you know, from spring onwards. But generally, when people want to, you know, or you know, go on a walk, we'll organise a group around that. And they're a lot of fun. They really are. So, I've been asked to possibly do one in a couple of weeks' time. You know, just in the lead up to December. Um, I do these videos on our YouTube channel. They take a lot of time
Mm.
when we, you know, get the stories we've kind of researched and piece them all together. And we get some collaborators. There's a dear friend called Graham Milne who tells some of the stories in the episodes. He's just released a new book, a shameless plug that I'm going to show
Yep,
you right now.
yep. And what's that
Tales.
called? What's it
It's
called?
called
Tales.
Tales from an Edinburgh Tour Guide by Graham Milne.
Okay.
And that's I've just glanced. I just got it yesterday, but it looks like it's going to be a lot of fun.
And I
I've
think
contributed.
you're in that, aren't you? You've contributed to that.
Yes, yes, I've contributed some of the stories, and also an Edinburgh collaborator called Kerry Powell has got 3 very good stories in it as well. So yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun. But apart from that, so as I was saying, the YouTube videos take a lot of time. We just did one recently, and I say that's going to be the last one of the year. But as it as it happens, I'm going to do one more, a Christmas special. So that's what I'll be recording between now and Christmas.
Oh, well, we'll make sure we keep an eye out for that one. And that, so what we'll do is all these things you mentioned, because obviously you've got Edinburgh, not just North Edinburgh, you've got Edinburgh covered, I think,
Yes.
with all the spookiness. We'll put that down in the show notes, and people will be able to find you and find your books and learn a little bit more about Edinburgh and North Edinburgh. So, John, it's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed it today, and look forward to talking to you the next time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you. Bye
It's a
bye.
pleasure. Cheers. Bye.